The much-awaited touchdown has happened. Aboard his Air Force One, US President Joe Biden landed in New Delhi. And then he headed straight to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's residence. The two leaders are holding bilateral talks as we speak. This happens to be President Biden's first presidential visit to India. And there has been a lot on the cards to discuss. Let's tell you about them. There are diverging views in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war. There is broad consensus over the Indo-Pacific crisis. Climate change has been a common topic of concern, and there are bilateral interests like economic cooperation and multilateral investment opportunities. Over the years, New Delhi and Washington have found an isolated space of diplomacy, where even with changing geopolitics, bilateral engagements have continued to foster. In fact, on your screen right now are live shots of the US President Joe Biden and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. These are live shots from New Delhi. US President Joe Biden is with India's Prime Minister. US President Joe Biden is with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The G20 Summit is going to kick off tomorrow. Big leaders, global leaders have arrived, including the US President Joe Biden. Now, to discuss what the two leaders spoke about, what's on the agenda for tomorrow, what we can expect from the big bilateral, let's go to our reporters. Our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who is in New Delhi, and Susan Teherani joins us from New York. Siddhant and Susan, thanks for joining us. Siddhant, I'll take my first question from you. Tell us a little bit about the bilateral. I know information is likely to come out much later, but what can we expect?
Well, just a short while ago, the visuals have been released from the Indian side. We saw with a lot of warmth, the Indian Prime Minister welcomed the American President Joe Biden at his residence here in Delhi. And we know that this is Joe Biden's first visit to India as the President of the United States. He has been to India several times, but in different capacities. The Indian Prime Minister was in Washington for a state visit earlier this year. And during today's conversations, the focus are likely to be on first civil nuclear conversation. There are talks of smaller reactors in which the Americans can help, the drone deal, also the jet engine deal, and above all the strong people-to-people relationship between the two countries. But of course, there are challenges as well. First, of course, is the visa delays, something that India has raised with the American side. Also, there are convergences, a lot of convergences in the Indo-Pacific, especially related to an increasingly aggressive China, which of course remains a worry for US, for India. India, of course, shares a long border with the Chinese, and we know how the situation has developed since the Galwan incident. So a range of issues are on the high table, but when it comes to the G20 Summit, we know that how both the countries can work together, especially in making sure there are consensus on issues related to climate change, or even perhaps Ukraine as well, is something that will be closely watched.
Right, Siddhant, you mentioned Russia, Ukraine, and of course China. Now I want to take my next question from Susan. Susan, the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping is missing, as is the Russian leader Vladimir Putin, but they will be discussed, I would assume, when Prime Minister Modi and President Biden sat down. What's your take on the same?
Absolutely. And President Biden is expected to take advantage of these two leaders' absence on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is no doubt that at the back of his mind is, since Vladimir Putin missed this meeting, will he be hosting North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un in Moscow during the G20? So that's an important aspect, and we are expected to hear a readout from the U.S. side, most likely regarding, as Siddhant mentioned, climate change and defense issues, but nuclear issues as well, and of course the safety and security of the Indo-Pacific. In regards to China, President Biden is really hoping to garner support not only from India, but other participating states for revamping international multilateral institutions like the World Bank. He's coming with a promise of $200 billion in aid for lower income countries to sort of take the place of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Right, Siddhant, a follow-up on that, $200 billion, that's a huge sum that's being promised. Tell us more on that. Right, Siddhant. I think
Yes,
there's some
I can
audio
hear you.
issue.
There was an audio
Right.
drop, but if I can...
Right, I'll repeat my question, Siddhant.
If I
Susan
can
just mentioned that Biden is coming with a promise, a kitty of $200 billion. That's a huge sum. How will that be deployed and what can we expect on that front?
Well, yes, of course, when it comes to the American president's visit, there is, of course, a focus on not only the bilateral aspect as to how, of course, the Americans can invest in the Indian economy, but also in a larger context of how there can be a conversation between the Americans, the Saudis and the Indians for a larger connectivity project. We know there's a strong buzz over a connectivity project that connects India with Europe via the Arab world, and essentially how things will happen. We will get to know in next 48 hours. But one thing I would like to flag is that we saw earlier this year the Indian NSA and the American NSA, along with the Saudi leadership. We saw a conversation that focused on this larger connectivity project. And this development comes at a time when the Chinese have been increasingly and aggressively investing in their connectivity projects. BRI is example of that, and how India sees that as a violative of its territory. So largely it's connectivity versus connectivity, that how India has been focusing or shaping its narrative on connectivity is that it should be transparent, respects sovereignty of countries, and it should not create a debt crisis, something we have seen with the Chinese connectivity projects. And there is the shared convergences between New Delhi and Washington regarding connectivity projects in Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region. But nonetheless, this is an important visit of the US president that will have major outcomes.
Right, Siddhant, thanks for joining us with the latest. Susan, one final question for you. Right before landing, Biden had tweeted that he's headed to G20, a premier forum for international economic cooperation, and he said that he's focused on making progress on Americans' priorities. Now, we know things back home aren't too great. His polling is lower. There's a lot of criticism coming for the US president. How will he keep Americans at home happy through the summit?
Yeah, that's going to be very difficult. And really, this trip is so important for the Biden administration to demonstrate that age is just a number and the president is capable of appearing as a global leader on the world stage on the one hand, but he's also coming with a message that America's economy is thriving, notably unemployment post-COVID-19. The issue with that is, according to polls, most Americans don't believe that. They don't see it in their pocketbooks. So that's one aspect of it. And then you have the other aspect, as I mentioned, the age, and then COVID-19. You know, Jill Biden, the First Lady, was just diagnosed with COVID-19, and President Biden really wanted to move past this issue, but leaving at home is an uncertainty about the future of COVID and also COVID mandates as well.
Absolutely. Right, Susan Tehrani, thanks so much for the latest. Thanks for joining us on WION World is One. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.